Okay, here we are, episode 7 of Biblical or Bible Basics. And today we're going to talk about the New Testament's order. Last time we talked about the New Testament's table of contents, time for that, the Bible's table of contents, time for that, the Bible, and I won't recite all the rest back to the beginning. But we want to talk about the order of the books. So if you have your Bible, open it up to the table of contents. It will have both the Old Testament and the New Testament in that table of contents. May have some other things too, depending on the kind of Bible you have. But the contents of the New Testament will be identical no matter what kind of Bible it is. If it's got the New Testament in it, it's going to have 27 books, and it's going to have exactly the 27 books that I'm going to talk about that I have in mind. They have the same names. So let's talk about the order of them. They are in a consistent order today. Now, in ancient times, they weren't always they were generally in this order, but not exactly in this order, every single one. And, maybe I'll mention some of those. But let me give you a sense of how they're organized and just understand that organization has generally held true, and has certainly held true for the last millennium and a half that we've had the complete New Testament. So first, there are the four Gospels. Gospel means good news, and the way they were labeled was the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. And sometimes they would have longer titles. It would say like the Gospel according to the Apostle John or whatever. But they're called short just by their name, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you know who wrote them just by the very name of the book. And those are all right in the front because those are all biographical and about Jesus, his life. Now, it mainly doesn't talk much about his childhood at all. It's only Matthew and Luke that tell us anything that happened in his childhood. Generally speaking, the Gospels cover from the time he was baptized by John the Baptist until he was crucified and raised from the dead. And the reason for that is that that's when the people writing the stories were around him. The apostles didn't grow up with Jesus. They, came to know him once he entered his public ministry. And he'd been an adult for a while when he became a minister. And during that time, he was a carpenter like his father in Nazareth. But when he entered the ministry, he moved to Capernaum, which was a town on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. And you probably know his closest disciples were fishermen. And Matthew now was a tax collector. He wasn't a fisherman. But at any rate, these four Gospels, that begins the New Testament because that's Jesus' life. Christianity begins with Jesus, with the life he lived. Now, the rest of the books, the very next book is called the Book of Acts. That's short for Acts of the Apostles. And that book describes what the apostles did, the acts, actions, deeds, doings, what the apostles did after Jesus was raised from the dead and ascended into heaven. He gave them instructions to go into all the world and preach the gospel, that is, the story of his suffering and his glory, the sufferings of the beatings and the humiliation and crucifixion, death, but then his glories, his resurrection from the dead, his ascension into heaven, his glorification, being seated at the right hand of God in heaven. So Acts tells about what the apostles did. And then all the rest of the books of the New Testament, they're called books, but they're, most of them are, I think the longest might be Luke's Gospel, which is 20-something thousand words, I think. That would be a very short book. Well, it'll certainly be a short book. The Duty of a Man, which I wrote, is a very short book. It's like 12,000 words. But most of the books I've written have been like, on average, 50,000 words, which is about the average length of a nonfiction book today. But anyway, we call them books. Sometimes they're called texts or writings. But all these other writings, all these other texts, all these other books in the New Testament are letters, epistles. Epistles and letters means roughly the same thing. Epistle is a little bit more formal word for what they are. But so we start with Romans, and you can count them down. There's 14 of them that are by the Apostle Paul. Those come first. Paul's letters, Paul's epistles. And after that come what are called the general epistles, or older historians will call them Catholic epistles, little c, not Roman Catholic as in Roman Catholic Church, but Catholic as in universal or general, in other words, applying to everyone. And these have different authors, not Paul. James, the brother of Jesus, he wrote one letter. Peter wrote 2 letters, Peter the Apostle. John the Apostle wrote 3 letters. And then Jude, who was another brother of Jesus, like James, wrote 1. So there's 7 letters that are written by people other than Paul. So you got 14 by Paul, 7 by Peter. 7 by these general authors. Isn't that interesting? Paul wrote twice as many letters as the others wrote. And then the last book, it's a letter too, but it's a circular letter. It's addressed to 7 different churches in what we call Asia Minor, which was in biblical times called Asia. It was a part of the Roman Empire. And these 7 churches, like if you looked at them on a map and you read them in order, it sort of makes a circle. So all 7 were addressed in that letter. And it's an unusual letter. I mean, it uses apocalyptic wordings, which, apocalyptic writings are in the Old Testament, primarily in Daniel and Ezekiel, and maybe a few other portions of books. But it certainly refers to, it writes in a way that's not, the people don't normally speak. So it's an unusual enough letter that it should be, that it would be set off by itself. And it's far longer than any of the other letters. So it's just, sometimes it's called the apocalypse. So when people describe the different types of books or the different genres of books in the New Testament, there's a couple of different ways they'll categorize them. One way to categorize them is to say that you've got the Gospels and the epistles, just kind of two separate groups. And in that kind of categorization, Acts can sometimes can be put with the apostles, sometimes put with the epistles. But you've got, let's say, 4 Gospels, and then the rest of the 27 are epistles. And then Acts either goes with the apostles or the epistles. So that's kind of divided up into 2 general kinds of types of writing or genres. And then another way to do it is divide it up into 4, where you got the Gospels, you got Acts as its own category, you got all the epistles except Revelation, and then you got Revelation. So Gospels, Acts, epistles, Revelation, divided up into 4 categories. And then within each category, there's usually an order too. And it's usually from the longest to the shortest. So for example, Paul's 14 letters, the first one is Romans, because that's the longest letter he wrote. Then First Corinthians, that's the second longest letter he wrote. But then 2 Corinthians is there too. So that's that kind of creates an exception. So because Paul's got 3 letters that go, where he's got 2 different letters going to the same party or parties. So he's got 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy. So you've got, in terms of churches, here's another interesting thing. You've got Paul's letters go to 7 different churches: Rome, Corinth, Galatia, that's 3. Ephesians, or Ephesus as the city, makes 4. Philippi makes 5. Colossians makes 6. And Thessalonians makes 7. So 7 letters to 7 churches. So that's interesting. John wrote Revelation to 7 churches, and Paul has written letters to 7 churches, to 2 of them more than once. And then you've got what are called the pastoral epistles of Paul. That's Paul's 2 letters to Timothy, to Titus, and Philemon, all of whom were co-workers with Paul. Sometimes Philemon is just considered a friend of Paul, and his is not called pastoral, but I think of it that way. But these are not, these categorizations are just ways to help us perceive and understand these different letters. They're not something we should get hung up on about. It's not like there's some law that they've got to be categorized a certain way. So longest to the shortest. And that just kind of gives you that'll give you a sense of the order that the books are put in. And as I say, it's consistent today. As far as what I've seen my whole life, I've never seen one that a New Testament that had them in a different order. Now, when the New Testament came together, or before the New Testament came together, a lot of these books circulated as sub-collections, as smaller groups. For example, the Gospels would circulate as together, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would usually be in one collection, and they would write them in what was called a codex. If we haven't covered that before, we ought to cover that at some point in time. But when they first started circulating, they couldn't make a codex big enough to hold the whole New Testament or the whole Bible. So that's one of the reasons they circulated in smaller groups. Paul's letters usually went out together. And then the general or Catholic epistles, that's James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude, they usually went out as a group with the book of Acts in it. So there were 3 major kind of smaller groupings that were circulating in these codexes or codices, depending on how the plural is rendered. And they would be moving about across the whole Roman Empire as people were sharing this new, these new writings that they had to learn about what God had done in their midst. And I think that's all we want to cover today. I hope I've given you at least a general sense of the order of the books and why they're there. Of course, the 4 Gospels, they cover the life of Jesus. Then he ascends into heaven after his resurrection. And then everything else takes place then. Nothing is ever taking place looking back. It's all going forward. The apostles go out and start preaching the gospel. That creates churches. People who believe the gospel would gather together regularly to learn more about the Messiah, the Messiah who's come, and about the coming of the kingdom of God and preparing for that. And the apostles, when they couldn't be in 2 places at once, they'd send a letter a lot of times. And sometimes when they wanted to reach multiple places they couldn't get to, they would write a general letter that would go to a broader group. And churches were copying these letters and passing them around to one another so that they, especially as the apostles began dying, usually through martyrdom, they could still study what they had written. And after they had gone, by the 4th century, say from the 1st to the 4th, these letters had individually circulated as small groups. And then finally in the 4th century, they came together because codex technology would allow an entire book to be put together. And that's when we have the entire New Testament. See you next time.